Joan mentioned that this was early on use of DNA evidence. It was actually the first time it was used in a Missouri court, and the first time in the country that it was used for a murder case where there was no body. As I remember the chronology a little bit about DNA evidence, I think it may be as recently as 1985 when the first use in a criminal case was made of DNA, and that was in Great Britain, and it was a rape and murder case. Actually, the DNA was used to solve the case because I don't believe there was a trial in it. In the United States, as I remember, it was a sexual assault case. It was in Florida. I happened to be at a conference in Florida, Orlando maybe it was, when the case was happening, and so I was following it on television and kind of filed that away in the back of my mind. So, well, that's a really cool tool. Maybe we'll be able to use that sometimes back in Boone County. As it turned out, we did. So that probably was also in 1985, maybe a little bit later in 85. So as this case was taking place, or as it was building, that was the first use of any in the country. So the chronology in our case started in August of 1974. That's when Susan and Ralph met. They began dating, and almost immediately they moved in together. 5 years later, October of 1979, they were married, and they moved to a house out on Obermiller Road, just north of Columbia. In between, before the time they got married, their son Robbie was born, and that was in August of 1978, followed in 1982, March of 1982, their daughter Angela was born. Everything was going really well. They're both very good parents. The family was involved in the community, involved in church, as I've discussed with one of the people that's here today, went to the same church that they did. But in 1985, the marriage started falling apart. There was a large amount of discord. At that time, Susan was working for or through Caroline and Company. Most of you know of that, I'm sure, temporary service agency, and she was placed at the Westinghouse Corporation out at the city power plant. She was a secretary out there. At about that time, Ralph was telling people, and he started suspecting and telling people that he thought Susan was having an affair with a coworker. Probably not true. We heard from a number of people that worked out there that Ralph was very controlling. He was very jealous, that he would show up when she was out with a group and would take her away, take her home. But in his mind, she was having an affair. On November 14th of 1985, Susan actually filed for divorce. 2 weeks later, she dismissed the action, and Ralph was never served, so it's not clear that he even knew that divorce had been filed, that dissolution petition had been filed. So in early May of 1986, 4 or 5 months after that filing of the divorce, Susan asked their pastor if he would come out to the house and talk to Ralph, and if he would take Ralph's guns, if he would remove Ralph's guns. She was fearful of Ralph and wanted all of the guns out of the house, and the pastor did that. A couple of weeks later, May 16th, there was a violent argument between the two of them, and it resulted in Susan having a number of bruises on her arms and on her face. This probably was taken at the sheriff's department when she reported that. You can't see the bruising, and probably that's why the photo was taken. But that's the way, at least that's the way she looked back in May of 1986. 5 days later, May 21st, third-degree assault charges were filed against Ralph, and Susan, in another action, was granted an ex parte order of protection, a protective order which prohibited Ralph from contacting her and from even being in the house on Obermiller Road. So in Missouri, ex parte means without a party, so a person can get this action, get this prohibition, without the other party being present. So for part of that, then you have to schedule an order of full protection hearing so the person can be present, can defend him or herself, and the order of protection then can go on. But she got the ex parte order, and the prohibitions were entered by the court. On that day, same day, May 21st, Susan left Columbia in her car and drove to Iowa with her 2 children to move in with her parents in Iowa. The hearings were set for June 2nd on both the assault case and on the ex parte order of protection, so she returned. Interesting that she rented a car to come back, even though her car was with her, and the assumption was that she didn't want Ralph to know where she was, and so she was kind of hiding herself from him. But on June 2nd, she reappeared. He was arraigned on the assault charge, and in fact, a full order of protection was entered. It was clear from later testimony from the neighbor, Dr. John Holstey, a veterinarian here in Columbia, lived next door, and he said Ralph had been at the home a number of times while she was in Iowa, which was in violation of the protective order, and he in fact asked Dr. Holstey to not mention that to the authorities. On June 5th, after the hearing, Susan returns to Iowa, and on June 5th, she came back to Columbia, driving her own car, came back to Columbia. Her purpose in doing that was, number one, to make sure she still had a job, to reestablish her residence here, and to then, if she did have the job, work for a week, and her plan was to return to Iowa on June 13th, on Friday, June 13th, to get her children and move back into their home on Obermiller Road. So that weekend, before the weekend, on June 5th, which I believe was a Friday, no, it was Thursday, June 5th on Thursday, when she first got there, she went over to Dr. Holstey's house. While she was there, Ralph showed up. Another argument, another assault. He took her car keys away from her, took them out of her hand, and Dr. Holstey went inside, called the police, the sheriff's office. They appeared and arrested Ralph for violation of the protective order, and again for another assault. And he had to post bond again. He went to jail and had to post bond again. Interestingly enough, her first night back in Columbia, Susan stayed at the women's shelter. She was afraid to be in the home. The second night, she got a hotel room. And then on that Saturday, on June 7th, she had a coworker change the locks on her home. She felt more secure at that time, so she moved back into the home. Before she left Iowa, she bought a German Shepherd and brought that dog back with them further for protection also. So she was very concerned about her safety. On then Monday, which was June 9th, she went to work, did a full day of work, left work at 6:15 that day, and that was the last time she was ever seen. She left work in her 1985 red Ford Escort, and that was it. They both disappeared. Both Susan and the car disappeared. She had, that weekend, had asked a coworker to call her on that Friday night to make sure she was okay because she was afraid of her husband. He said he called twice, and there was no answer, and then he was the one that when she did not appear for work on June 10th, called her mother in Iowa to give her all this information. And later that morning, June 10th, Tuesday, 1986, Susan's mother, Janet Ray, reported her officially missing. So the Sheriff's Department did all kinds of things in the interim, looking mostly for the car because they figured that was going to lead maybe to the location of Susan. One of the things they did is they contacted Ford Motor Credit, who had financed the car. Still payments were being made on it, and asked that if any information came to them about the car, that they notify them. So if somebody makes payments on it, we want to know who made the payments and when they made payments, all of those different things. So they apparently flagged the file with that information. So 1 year later, this is a digression, but something that will tie in later. On June 23rd of 1987, Rhonda Cleaver disappeared. Some of you will recognize that name. She and her husband were house-sitting at the John Holstey house next door while that family was out of town. They had been house-sitting at that house when Susan Davis disappeared. 1 year later, she's there. She goes out for a jog, never seen again. So hold that in your mind. We'll get to it at the end of the presentation. Because of the similar circumstances and the similar location, of course, Ralph was a prime suspect in that disappearance also. In fact, was questioned about it. He involved himself in the search for Rhonda Cleaver out there around that area. But, again, no information. Again, that's just filed. On March 8th, 1988, 21 months later, Boone County Sheriff's Department was contacted by Ford Motor Credit and had told that the 1980 Ford Escort, for which they'd been searching, was in a storage facility in Jefferson City, Missouri. The storage facility, Apache used stored in Apache Flats, said that the renter of that unit had missed payments for a period of time, and for the last 6 months had made no payments at all. So they were going to sell the car. They had a right to do that under the contract. They did a lien search, found that Ford Motor Credit did have a lien on it. They contacted Ford Motor Credit and said, we'd like for you to release the lien so we can sell this car, and we'll give you whatever money there is. And they said, we need to do something else. And so they called the Sheriff's Department. This was actually the storage unit, I believe, was the third one back there. I'm not completely sure of that. The car, when they got inside, was in fact the red Ford Escort for which they were looking. Serial numbers and VINs and all of that matched. The car, you'll see a tarp, plastic tarp, over that windshield. They didn't do that. That was the way it appeared when they got there, and there was no window on the driver's side door. Large amounts of blood throughout the car. This was, when the front seat was taken out, this was the back floorboard behind the driver's seat with large deposits of blood. All that dark stuff appeared to be blood. Throughout the car, there was what appeared to be human tissue. Their assumption was that it was brain tissue. No way of telling that, but able to tell that it was tissue. Front windshield had a crack in it. The rearview mirror, if you turn it and push it, it goes right to that impact point. The idea probably was that a large object, maybe a head, had hit that rearview mirror and cracked the front windshield. More of the tissue was on the other side. You'll see up in the right corner a cut, and in that there was a shotgun pellet. The one above that, too, I believe, was a shotgun pellet. And all throughout the floor of the car, there were shotgun pellets. And this is the granulated glass, the fragments of glass that had once made up the front door driver's side window. So apparent that something pretty violent had happened there in the car. She had disappeared, as you will remember, on June 9th of 1986, and that particular unit was rented on June 10th, the next day, 1986, by someone named Ralph Davis. That was what all of the contract said. I had his name on it. Talked with the woman who had done the rental, and she couldn't identify Ralph from pictures, although we didn't have any good pictures of Ralph. But she did say it was a black man. He was very nervous. He asked to use the bathroom, said his stomach was upset. And from her office, he called for a taxi to take him back to Columbia. She heard that he was going back to Columbia. So the Sheriff's Department and the Columbia Police Department processed this crime scene, took all the information that they had from there, all of that, sent off different pieces of the evidence to get some preliminary examinations. We're fortunate in Columbia, I was fortunate in Boone County to have amazing resources here. Our law enforcement agencies were among the best in the state. Our evidence technician at the Columbia Police Department, Mike Himmel, was probably the best in the state. We had the entire university to work with, and one of the people that they sent the fragments to was Dr. Sam Stout, he's a professor of anthropology at the university. Used a serologist at the Highway Patrol Lab, and they were able to come up with preliminary information, preliminary findings, that the blood in the car, what appeared to be blood in the car, was blood, and that it was human blood, that the fragments found in the car were human bone fragments. So with that information and the fact that Ralph, over the preceding 21 months, had said time and time again that he had no idea where the car was, the Sheriff's Department met with me and said, do we have enough for an arrest, and where do we go from here? And in my mind, with that much information, that was enough to file a charge, although certainly no slam bang that this is going to result in a conviction, but enough to do a charge, and obviously you need to file a charge in this case. But as I said, I think it's important that you get him committed to some kind of a story that we can use at trial. So they did that. And that was on March 10th. The meeting with them was on March 9th. All the findings that came were on March 9th. On March 10th, they arranged for Ralph to come to the police department to be interviewed. And the way they encouraged him to do that was they said, Ralph, it's been almost 2 years. We want to put an end to this case. We want to close it. It's a dead case. We want to close it. We just need to wrap up, go through all of this part, and you can help us with that. So if you would come in, we'll do that. He did. They were watching him from the time he left home, or left his office, I believe, at that time. From the time he left his office, they were observing what he was doing. He came to the police department and parked, sat in his car, and then left and drove 2 or 3 blocks around, came back and parked again, sat in his car, and finally came in. I guess he was figuring out, what am I going to do here? What am I going to say here? What are they going to say to me? When Ralph came to the office and started the testimony, that's the way he looked. That was on that day. He was asked first by the sheriff's department, or a police detective in sheriff's department, about the Ford Escort. Do you have any information now about where it was? Did anything happen in the last 21 months? He said, nope, I have no idea where it was. They asked him a number of different ways, a number of different times, I think 4 different times. Each time he said, I have no idea where that car is. At that point, they confronted him with the rental agreement and the fact that there was all kinds of human tissue, blood, bone, shotgun pellets in this car. So he changed his story at that time. His story at that time was that Susan had come to his office on June 10th, on the day that we know he put the car in storage, and told him she was leaving him. When he turned away from her to walk away, turned back around, and she had drawn a pistol from somewhere, was pointing it at him, and she had the pistol in one hand and the car keys in the other. He said, I knew she wouldn't shoot me, so I grabbed the keys out of her other hand, and I went out, got in the car, and I drove away. Sheriff's department said, well, there's blood all over the car. How'd that happen? He said, well, when she came out to the car, before I drove away, she rammed the pistol and her hand through the window, cut her arm severely, and bled all over the car. So that's why all that blood was in the car. Well, with these statements, Ralph was arrested for second-degree murder. I charged him with second-degree murder. And got search warrants to go first to the house. This was the house on Obermiller Road. That's the front of it. This is the back of it, to see what could be found there. And there were a number of things. Among those things was a shotgun that had been purchased on June 9th. Ralph had been arraigned in Associate Circuit Court that morning, the morning of June 9th, left and went out to Guns, Liquor, and Ammo, Bass, whatever it was, and purchased this shotgun. They were able to match up that purchase to the numbers on the gun. There were also 2 partially used bottles of shotgun shells, and this will be apparent later as to why this is important, a number of prescriptions. One of those was a bottle of tetracycline, a prescription for Susan Davis with her name on it that had been filled 3 days before her disappearance. When she first came back from Iowa to Columbia, she'd gotten a prescription of tetracycline. They went to Ralph's office and searched it, and more things were found. One of the things they found was a bill from Apache Used Store It that was in his trash can, still in his trash can after all this time. Who knows why that would be. But they also found both sets of keys to the red Ford Escort. They found Susan's diamond ring from her first marriage, canceled checks to Apache Used Store It, and the padlock that was on the door, or the keys to the padlock that was on the door of the storage unit. So a wealth of evidence that we have, maybe not enough, but a wealth of evidence. We have a preliminary hearing, gave a bare bones presentation of the evidence, and Ralph was bound over for trial, and at that time, I changed the charge from second-degree murder to murder in the first degree. Murder in the first degree in Missouri requires additional elements. So the elements that had to be proven at that time were Susan Davis was in fact dead, Ralph Davis was the one that killed her, and that Ralph had planned to kill her. You don't have to show a planning, but you have to show that there was cool and full reflection before the assault actually occurred. Most people consider cool and full reflection to be some form of planning. So that's what we were facing when we went to trial. So the trial began 1 year later, roughly 1 year later, March 14th, 1989. I researched or looked for what no-body murder cases I could find, and most of them involved the proof of death through circumstantial evidence, laying out everything that person, the victim, would have expected to have been done during the intervening time when this person was missing, and then showing that none of that happened with this person. So it's a circumstantial case in most of those. I couldn't find a conviction where there was no confession or an eyewitness. And I thought, well, that's not encouraging. But I did key in on the circumstantial evidence. At trial, presented evidence that showed that Susan was particularly close with her mother, that they sometimes would talk as many as 3 times a day. Talked almost every day, sometimes as many as 3 times. Her mother testified and said she had had no contact with her daughter since June 9th of 1986, was it? Yes, 1986. Her co-workers testified how much she worshiped her children, that her life revolved around her children. All of her stories were about things that she did with her children, actually that they had done with their children, and the fact that there was no way she believed she could live without them. And the testimony was that there had been no contact, again, from Susan Ray, who had custody of the children later on. There had been no contact with the children, again, since June, actually it was June 5th, the Friday before, in 1986. No taxes had been filed under Susan Davis' name. No withholding had been done for Susan Davis. No visa was granted for travel aboard. No criminal history. No traffic tickets. No auto registration in any of the 50 states. And one of the co-workers testified or identified the ring that was found at Ralph's office as her wedding ring from her first marriage, and said that Susan wore it every day, that she had never seen her without that ring. So next move to, did Ralph actually plan to kill her? Did he actually want her dead? Dr. Holste testified that during the last week of May, he had told Dr. Holste, this was while, after the charges had been filed against Ralph and before Susan had actually returned to Columbia, he told Dr. Holste that he believed that Susan was having an affair and stated the only way to stop a whoring bitch like that is to shoot her. And he bought the gun on the afternoon of June 9th. He actually was the one that checked the car into the storage unit on the next day. That on the 12th, 2 days after he checked it into the storage unit, he let the police, the sheriff's department, into their home on Obermiller Road with the keys to the new locks that Susan had placed on the doors. He moved back into the house on June 14th, even though there was a restraining order prohibiting him from being in the home. And then 1 week before trial, one of these things that sometimes seems a little bit stranger, or truth being stranger than fiction, I was going out to dinner out at Alexander's Steakhouse out in the Biscayne Mall, I think it is, the cook-it-yourself steak place. I was late, but I was I was refereeing a charity basketball game. There were 3-4 couples that went out there, and it went late enough that I almost didn't go. But well, I'll meet up with them there, and we'll see what we're doing later. I got there; they were about finished eating, but I said, "Well, I'll just eat off of your plates," which I do quite often. And the waiter came to the table and said, "Why don't you go to the salad bar?" He said, "I don't want to charge you for it. Go to the salad bar and do that." And I said, "Oh, okay, I did that." And as we got up to leave, that same waiter came up and he said, "Are you Joe Moseley?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." And he said, "Are you prosecuting Ralph Davis?" And I said, "Yes." This is 2 weeks before trial, as I remember. I said, "Yes, I'm doing that." And he said, "Well, I knew Ralph." He said, "Ralph was a close friend." And I said, "Oh." He said, "And I've agonized over this for a while, and I think there's something I need to tell you. And it's tough because Ralph is a friend of mine. But first of all, when Susan was back in Iowa, or after she had disappeared, actually, Ralph had told him a number of times that he had no idea where the car was. And he hadn't seen it since the time that Susan had disappeared. He also said at that time, when you find the car, you'll find Susan. And before that, he said, he'd been out with Ralph. Ralph had been drinking quite a bit during this period of time. And he speculated to his friend that she had been unfaithful to him. And then he said, if I found out she had been screwing around on me, I would have to blow her away. Cool and full reflection. I asked him if he would testify. He was reluctant to do that, but he said, I think it's probably something I do. And he was a pretty strong witness. It was evident he didn't want to be there. It was evident that he felt close to Ralph. But this was a duty that he thought he should perform, and he went ahead and testified. So we've got the circumstantial evidence. We've got Ralph's purported planning. And then we move to the direct evidence in the case. And the first part of that is the car, because that's where everything is found. It's always nice to be able to say enough to place a jury at the scene of a crime. And that's why I would go out to scenes of crime, so I could try to tell the jury exactly what it was like. Well, in this case, we talked about there being a way to bring the scene of the crime to the jury. Judges are reluctant to let juries leave and go out to a scene, lose control of them, but we thought we could maybe bring this to the court. I had permission of the court to actually present the car in the courtroom. Law enforcement set about, when I got permission, law enforcement set about to find another car, same year, a 1985 Escort. It wasn't red, but they made it red. They took everything already had been taken out of the other car, so they cut this car into pieces. I think it was only 4 pieces. It might have been more than that. And on the second day of trial, they brought the car into the courtroom after the jury was dismissed and put it back together. Redid a 1985 red Ford Escort. Trials had already started on March 14th, and in the courtroom, this is the way the car looked, what was left of the car. That was on the floor of the courtroom. There they have put the car back together, the passenger area of the car, and then they start taking all of the evidence that we have and putting it back in the car. This is the way it was when they had the front seats back in. They put containers with the bone fragments, with the shotgun pellets back in the car. When they found the car, there were air fresheners in the car. Ralph had bought air fresheners and put them in the car. There also were swipe marks over some of the blood in the car. So there'd been an attempt to clean it up and then an attempt to freshen it. Anyway, that's the way the car looked when they put it back together. You see the air freshener, the 2 air fresheners that are in there. This is the back or the front row of the jury box. So this is what the jury is looking at when they come into court the next morning with the car sitting there. We testified about the car and everything that was in it, and then allowed the jury to go down the judge allowed the jury to go down and actually look through the car and get a feel for what that was like when it was discovered. After we finished, I asked the judge if we could leave the car in the courtroom because I needed to refer to it in closing argument. Defense attorneys, of course, thought that was not a good idea. But I told the judge, I said, we can move it easily to the other side of the courtroom. We'll cover it up so nobody will notice it, and then it will be there for closing argument. Sheriff's Department, of their own volition, found the brightest neon tarp that they could find, covered it. The table where the defendant is sitting and I'm sitting is between us, and then the jury box. So every time the jury looked at the defendant, they were looking at the car looming in behind him. It's just kind of an accidental thing that happened that turned out to be really worthwhile. So next we get into all of the professionals who are going to testify about what all of that evidence that we found meant. The first of those was Dr. Stout. Dr. Stout from the anthropology department. He testified that in March of 1988, the day after the car was found, he received 31 possible bone fragments that were recovered from that Ford Escort. The fragments were small and fairly similar in size. The largest actually was roughly the size of half of the fingernail on a small finger. So those are pretty small, and that was the largest of the group. Under microscopic examination, he observed, and I'm going to read this because I don't know these words. They were his words. There was a lamellar pattern typical of bone and the presence of osteons that provided conclusive evidence that the fragments were indeed bone. That was the first question. The next question, whether the fragments were of human origin. He said the presence of the osteons, which were called Haversian systems, eliminated several, you'll remember that I'm sure, eliminated several species such as small mammals and birds since they did not exhibit Haversian bone remodeling. And the size of the osteons increases as the body size of the species increases, and it got a chart as to what each size means, and this falls squarely within the size range for humans. The next question was, well, what part of the body is this from? That becomes important. So core samples were taken from a skeleton, so he knew what all the areas were that were on that skeleton. They were compared with the fragments from the skull. The recovered fragments clearly matched those of the skull rather than of a long bone. One of the fragments resembled a bone from the orbital region, up here around the eye and the nasal area, and another exhibited a surface curvature only observed in the bones of the skull. So this, I believe, was what those cross-sections were. They don't mean anything to me, but they meant something to him, and he presented these pictures to the jury and told them what it was, what it meant to him. When the bones, several of the bone fragments exhibited dark areas on the bone, you'll see it most prominently up in the upper left there. And a scanning electron microscope was utilized to determine the chemical composition of those dark areas, and the shotgun pellets also. So both of those were put under the scanning electron microscope. The elemental composition of the dark smudges on the bone produced a prominent peak for lead and a small antimony peak. Actually, it was 99% lead, 1% antimony. Antimony is an alloy that's often combined with lead to strengthen it. When the shotgun pellets were under the microscope, they had exactly the same makeup, 99% lead and 1% antimony. So and then later, when the bone sections were examining using fluorescent microscopy, there was this yellow banding that appeared there and here, both of those, fairly prominent. And there are charts that put different colors up as to what each of those means. And this one indicated without any doubt that it was a tetracycline-like antibiotic. Because they were on the surface rather than embedded, it meant to Dr. Stout that that antibiotic had been taken 3 months or less from the time that those bone fragments were removed from the body. So his testimony, in conclusion, was that the fragments recovered from the Ford Escort were from the skull of a human who had taken a tetracycline-like antibiotic within approximately 3 months of death. Further, the skull fragments had been impacted with lead similar to that from the shotgun pellets recovered from the car. So with this evidence, along with the serology from the Highway Patrol saying there was human blood found in the car, Dr. J. Dix, the medical examiner at that time, again, probably the best one in the state, testified that there was no doubt that a human being had died as a result of a gunshot wound to the head in the 1985 red Ford Escort. In his mind, in his professional opinion, no human could survive a wound to the head of that severity, particularly resulting in the amount of blood that he had personally observed in the car. He couldn't quantify it, but he said it's a lot of blood. And anybody that would bleed that much, they're not going to survive that. So at that point, felt we had pretty much confirmed that somebody had died in the car. And now we had to add to the circumstantial evidence to show that it was Susan Davis that had died. And that's where the DNA evidence comes in. There was actual, and I hope you would agree, there was ample circumstantial evidence to prove that Susan was the person that died in the car, but juries are sometimes suspicious of circumstantial evidence. They just don't believe that raises to the level of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They sometimes have in their mind they're just supposed to be proof beyond any doubt whatsoever, even though it's not. And as many times as you admonish them, say, yeah, well, it's circumstantial evidence. So that's where we go to the DNA. This is what Dr. Garner from Cellmark Laboratories, who's the one that brought us our evidence that we sent the samples to, and this is what he presented in court. There was another unique aspect to the DNA evidence in this case. We did not have a sample of Susan Davis's blood or tissue any time before she disappeared, so there was nothing to compare the unknown samples in the car to. Not surprising, but it would have been better. So the next best way to do that is through paternity testing. You compare the DNA makeup of the parents of the person, and if that person, if the unknown samples come from those two people, roughly in equal amounts, because that's what DNA does, you get roughly equal amounts from each parent, well, then you've got the person. The problem being Susan was adopted, and we had no idea who the biological parents were. So the next best way, as we found out when I talked with Cellmark Laboratories, is to get blood samples from the two children, get a court order to get a blood sample from the defendant, eliminate those things that their father, the defendant in the case, contributed to them, and see if what remained in their blood samples came from their mother, from Susan Davis. So we did that. 5 samples were sent to Cellmark Laboratories. This was the other thing. This shows something about DNA. So I'll go back just a minute. I don't know anything about this, but I remember a little bit of it from the trial because Dr. Garner took me to school and taught me some of this. DNA forms itself in a double helix, what you'll see in the upper left-hand corner, kind of like if you took a water hose and you bent it. It's like that. It's a tubular, and it has this helix, double helix property to it. There are 4 bases that are in that. I'm not going to try to pronounce them, but they're AT, referred to as A2, AT, and G and C. They come in pairs. They always, A is always with T, G is always with C. So this is part of how you're able to make up the DNA fingerprints. A gene, as you know, is a segment of DNA, and that's what determines what a person's genetic makeup is, their hair color, their eye color, if there are any kind of abnormalities. And as I'd said, that comes almost equally from the parents. DNA, he testified, Dr. Garner testified, molecules contain more than 3 billion units, and although a human receives half of that DNA composition from each parent, the final links of the DNA are unique to that individual. Even though you'll have brother and sister have the same parents, their DNA makeup is going to be unique, unless it's identical twins, and then it is identical. Identical twins have identical genetic makeup. The process or the procedures, and that's what this chart shows and what he testified to the jury, he took them to school also, was that there is extraction, fragmentation, electrophoresis, southern blotting, hybridization, and finally an autoradiograph, which is down in the right-hand corner, you'll see there. It looks like a barcode that you see at the supermarket, basically, and it's got the genetic makeup. This is the one that he presented to the jury. He had the 2 unknown samples, and then he had the 3 samples from the 2 children and Ralph Davis. Hard to see there, but if you're close enough, you can actually see that some of those line up, the unknown blood sample at the top, line up with Angela Davis and with Robbie Davis, particularly after you eliminate everything that their father, Ralph Davis, presented to them. Dr. Garner testified that 2 of the bands in the unknown sample matched Robbie, and 4 of those matched Angela. He further testified that to a scientific certainty, the 2 previously unknown samples came from the mother of Robbie and Angela Davis. The percentage of probability for Robbie was 99.99%, and for Angela, it was 99.9999%. He concluded his testimony stating that the possibility that the blood in the car came from someone other than Susan Davis was 1 in 22 billion, which at that time was roughly 4 times the world population. I think a jury could understand that. As long as they believed Dr. Garner, I believe that they would be convinced that it was Susan Davis that died in the car. Interestingly, the defense had already had also received samples. They asked for samples, and they sent it off to LifeMark, or Life Codes Laboratories, which was the other DNA fingerprinting lab in the country at that time. And they never provided us with any of their results, and they didn't introduce the evidence at trial. So the assumption being that they pretty much agreed with Cellmark Laboratories. So after that's how we closed our part of the trial. The defense principally was based upon testimony from the defendant, and he changed his story again. He said he was worried that his wife leaving him and taking the car. Both of those things concern me. He didn't want to lose the car, number one. He said he had paid for it. He didn't want to lose it. And that he thought that he might be able to save his marriage if Susan could not leave town in that car. He met 2 guys in Douglas Park. He gave them $200 and the keys, one set of the keys to the red Ford Escort, and asked them to steal the car from Susan, to follow her and steal the car and bring it to him. The next morning, he found it parked outside of his office, and the window was broken out. Well, that concerned him. He said there'd be no reason to break the window out. They had the keys to the car. Didn't think anything more about it. He drove the car from his office first to the food barn, and then later that day moved it to the Knowles parking lot out on Nifong, the Knowles that used to be out on Nifong. 2 days after that, he took the car and drove it to Jefferson City. So this is somewhat later than June 10th. He drove it to Jefferson City. He said, on the way, I noticed that there was blood in the car. And so I got some paper towels, and I wiped up the blood that was in the car. The story, and that was his whole story, did not explain much of the physical evidence that was in the case, didn't touch on much of that. And his timeline was completely off, or quite a bit off, from the one that we'd established earlier at the trial. Under cross-examination, Ralph did not do particularly well. But the defense finished their case with his testimony, and then we went to closing argument. I gave my first half of the closing argument. The defense gave theirs. And then at the end of their closing argument, the defense attorney finished with, how can you be certain beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant's wife is dead if nobody is discovered? So I get the final shot. You divide in criminal cases your first and seconds. And then I told you I'd researched those no-body murder cases, and in one of them I came across a quote from a judge on appeal, and I saved it in case it came up. So when the defense attorney said that, I brought out the quote. The fact that a murderer may successfully dispose of the body of the victim does not entitle him to an acquittal. That is one form of success for which society has no reward. I think that may have been a Charles Manson case. I didn't want to say that because I wasn't sure of it, but I think it was a Charles Manson case. He had a no-body murder case. But it was a great quote, and I appreciated that the judge provided that. Trial lasted 4 days, completed March 17, 1989. The jury deliberated for less than an hour and returned with a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. And then in Missouri, you have bifurcated trials on a capital murder case. You get to guilt, and if you find the person guilty, you have another hearing right immediately after the verdict comes in to determine what the punishment should be. To get a death penalty in Missouri, you have to present aggravating circumstances. So that case was presented, and aggravating circumstances were presented. And this deliberation lasted for a little more than 5 hours, and they resulted, the jury returned with a death penalty verdict in the case. Janet Ray, Susan's mother, testified, as I had mentioned, at the trial, and she stayed for all of it. And she would come to my office every night after we had finished testimony, and she would go over what had happened in court and talk about the evidence, what seemed strong, what was weak. And I think to give me a pep talk, I never knew for sure, but I think she was trying to keep me pepped up. And after all of the after both verdicts were in, she came back to the office. And she asked if she could have some of the evidence in the case. She said it was all that was left of her daughter, that she'd like to have some of it so she could bury it and give her grandchildren some level of closure. So how am I going to say no to that? I talked to the sheriff's department. They cut out a large part of the carpet with the blood on it in the car, and she returned to Iowa with it. And I called her maybe 2 weeks later and asked how everything was going, and she said, well, we had a funeral, and it was a really nice funeral, and the kids are doing really well. I mean, better than I would expected. Not great, but doing much better than I expected. So that was good to hear. And I'd mentioned earlier that Rhonda Cleaver disappeared 1 year after Susan. 2 years later, well, before that, before the 2 years later, after the trial, let me go back. After the trial, I had Ralph Davis brought into the sheriff's office. I had $10,000 in cash brought from the bank and put it on the sheriff's desk, because the family had offered a reward of $10,000 for any information leading to the discovery of Rhonda Cleaver's body. And I told Ralph that, and I said, this $10,000 is here. It's yours. And I will sign an affidavit that I will not prosecute you. The family is more interested in recovery of the body than they are prosecution. So I won't prosecute you, and I'll sign an affidavit to that effect. Just tell us where Rhonda Cleaver's body is. He said, I don't know where it is, just like I don't know where Susan's body is. I don't know where Susan is. I think she's still alive in Texas, so I don't know any of this. So we said, okay, this doesn't work. We still believed he was the one that had murdered Rhonda Cleaver also, and he went off to the penitentiary. And then, 2 years later, remains of a body were found north of Columbia, up near the Pinnacles. We took those remains to a forensic odontologist along with x-rays of teeth from our missing people. We assumed this was Susan Davis that was found. So we took these up to the forensic odontologist, and he said, well, I've made a match. And he said, there's no doubt in my mind that those teeth came from Rhonda Cleaver. Oh, really? We hadn't thought about that, so we set about how are we going to convict Ralph of this now, of killing Rhonda Davis. This was in the remains were found in a cellar on this farm. The farm was owned by the Canine family. They'd moved away from the farm. One of the Canine kids had gone up to the farm to look in the cellar for fruit jars that he thought he could sell, and when he went down into the cellar, he found a number of bones down there. They were scattered around. Critters had been in there, and they were scattered around. There was no head. There was no skull, but found all of these bones, so that's what was recovered. And then after they looked around the farm, they happened to look down in the well and found a skull down in the well, and that's where we got the teeth in the case. So we left the forensic odontologist's office, and one of the detectives called the sheriff and said, hey, I remember when Rhonda Cleaver disappeared, we were getting all of these calls with tips on what may have happened. And one of those said, you ought to look at this guy named Larry that works out at Michael's in the framing shop. He was off that day, and he was hunting up at the Canine farm. This guy all of a sudden remembered Canine had shown up somewhere else. He went back through all the files, and he found that. So here's the timeline. Susan Davis reported missing June 10th, 1986. June 23rd, 87, Rhonda Cleaver reported missing. March 8th, 88, Susan Davis' car is found in storage. March 10th, Ralph Davis arrested and charged. March 14th, 1 year later, Ralph Davis is tried. March 17th, 1988. Oh, wait a minute. That's 89. Convicted of murder. March 20th, 1980, 1 year later, Rhonda Cleaver's remains are discovered. And then 7 days later, 1 week later, Larry Don Salmon was arrested and charged. And on June 22nd, he pled guilty to murder of Rhonda Cleaver. Cases had nothing to do with each other. They had to have something to do with each other. They had nothing to do with each other. But that timeline is scary. June, March. And then the final disposition of the second case in June of 1980. So that will set up another presentation when we have time to do that. Are there any questions?
She noticed through neighbors or something that Ralph Davis, after Susan disappeared, had poured a new concrete patio.
Right.
So do you want to talk about that?
One of the things that was done was that was broken up and nothing there. We had a lot of things. We had information that that Ralph had taken a load of trash at about this time out to the city dump. And had taken all of these limbs and stuff back there. Nobody went with him. Dumped all of those things off, and then the bulldozer came and covered them up. Yeah, probably not. But that would have been a good way to dispose of a body also. Fred? He was an insurance agent. He had his own agency. He had worked at Sears selling an insurance at one time. And then he opened his own agency, and he wasn't very good at it. One of the parts of his testimony was, if that was a crime scene, if I had killed my wife and stored that car, do you think there's any way I wouldn't have paid for the rental in there? And when I would let you guys find where this is? Pretty good question. And so when I asked him, I said, well, but you didn't have any money. You didn't have money to do that. And he said, no, I'm a successful insurance agent. Well, it happened when they had searched his office that they found his tax returns from that year, from 1986. And I'd kept those. And so when he testified that he'd made a lot of money, I'd asked my office investigator to go down to the file and come up with that tax return. And I looked at it, and he had reported income from 1986 of $3,356. And so I said, no, you didn't have any money. This is what it is. Is that what you made that year, or did you lie to the IRS? And he didn't have a good answer for that. So, yes, but he was an insurance agent.
I have a question about, obviously, like, this was an interracial relationship. What was the racial makeup of the jury, and was there any kind of, like, racial biases that were coming into this case?
No, I don't believe there were, actually. The makeup, as I remember, there were 2 African Americans on the jury panel, but this never came up. In fact, there was testimony from the co-workers that Susan was very proud of the fact that she was married to a black man, that she would bring that up over and over again, that that was part of what she thought was good about her and about their relationship. So it really never came up.
Did Ralph Davis have any kind of a criminal history prior to all this
Nothing
happening?
significant. No, not at all. Over here, and we'll go back there.
I have a question about DNA. Suppose he had paid to keep the car in storage for another 20 years or so. Does DNA deteriorate over time, or would you still have been able to identify it?
Oh, it was, yes, the DNA would have still been there. What doesn't make sense is why he didn't go pick up the car and drive it off in the river somewhere, or maybe just keep paying the thing. But yes, the DNA evidence would have still been accurate.
So you said that Ralph Davis submitted a DNA sample so that they could determine the body. Did the defense willingly go with that, or did they kind of fight? I would have fought it if I was the defense giving a DNA sample.
Got a court order, immediately got a court order before we even let the defense know we were going to do that. So he was ordered by the court to give up the sample. As it happened, his brother was very successful. Ralph Davis's brother was very successful and testified during the penalty portion of the trial about their relationship. And he then financed the appeal. He got another attorney for the appeal. Why he didn't do it for the trial itself, I don't know. But the defense attorney was very good.
You mentioned the appeal. What would be what would they be going after? What would they attack on appeal? I would have thought the whole thing with the car in the jury would have been prejudicial, and I wondered, whether they attacked that, though the case was very strong. So what would they go after in the appeal?
Okay, they did not attack that. They kind of gave up on that. The main part of the appeal, a large part of the appeal, was on the admissibility of DNA evidence because it is so new. In Missouri, you have something prior to presenting scientific evidence called the Fry hearing, and in that, the court then has to determine that this is accepted, widely accepted within the scientific community, and we did that. They challenged that on appeal, and the Supreme Court of Missouri wrote a long dissertation on DNA evidence, why it was accurate, why it was presumed to be accurate, and why it should have been admitted. You know, there's a lot of connections. You live in this neighborhood, I mean, in this county for this long, you're connected with, I'm probably half the people in this room, number one, but all of the people that testified in the trial were close friends of mine, actually. I've worked with them quite a bit, and close friends. Jay Dix, that testified, was a neighbor of mine. And on the appeal to the Supreme Court, one of the concurring justices was Ann Covington, who was also a close friend. Interestingly, she concurred in the guilt, and she dissented in whether in one of the fines, aggravating circumstances that allowed for the death penalty, but she did concur in that. But they didn't challenge the car at all.
Was he ever put to death?
Was? Oh, I'm guessing it was early 2000, something like that. I think he was in the penitentiary for a little over 10 years. What? 99 is when, okay, so it was almost exactly 10 years later, yes. This was the subject of a couple of NBC shows. One of them was called Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. What was the guy's name that did it? Well, the idea was they were looking at scientific things, and in this case, it was what yesterday was a big deal in scientific evidence and what's today and what's going to be tomorrow. Well, yesterday was fingerprinting. Today was DNA evidence, and so they reenacted the case. We reenacted it in the courtroom. They had Ralph Davis look-alike, and we reenacted. Chuck Scarborough was the one that did it. And as he left, he was going over to Potosi to talk to Ralph Davis, and he asked, "Hey, did you have any question that you want to ask Ralph? I'm going to go over there." And I said, "Well, ask him where the body is." And about a week later, Chuck Scarborough called me and he said, "Hey, I asked Ralph your question." I said, "Oh, really? Did he tell us where the body was?" And he says, "No, he thinks she's still alive and living in Texas with her boyfriend." I said, "Okay, well, that's that." But 10 years later.
Did he have contact with his children during this trial time?
I don't know about Angela, but his son actually was in contact with him quite a bit. Robbie was. Before he was, not before he was convicted. They had no contact. They were with their grandmother in Iowa, with Janet and her husband in Iowa. So there was no contact then. But then after he was convicted, then Robbie would contact him, and quite often. I'm not sure about Angela, though. But, you know, by all accounts, testimony and just people that we had talked to, Ralph was a very good father. He was very close with his children, and he took care of them very well, and had a really cool relationship. So, I mean, you look at these kids, their mother is gone, disappeared, dead, and it's their father that did it. That just doubles the problem here.
Do we have any more questions? Well, how about another hand for Joe Moseley?